Wonderful. So here we are. Welcome to the Enlight Life podcast. I am delighted to be here with Professor Bill Lawrence, attorney and scientist, with a very interesting story, which I will let him share. But the reason why we've invited Bill Lawrence once again to speak with us is because he's been conducting research on peptide bioregulators for more than 12 years now. And in many ways, the findings that he can share with us is really the most solid evidence that we have in terms of why should everyone know about peptide bioregulators and why should everyone be using them. So welcome to the podcast, Professor Bill Lawrence, and we're delighted to have you here and speaking with you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. We're halfway around the world from each other, so.
We are. And so, yeah, I would love for you to share a little bit the story of how you got into peptide bioregulators, because it's a wonderful personal story and really a testimony to also how amazing these peptide bioregulators are. And since I can actually see you and attest to, you know, how great and strong and vital you are looking, you must be doing something right.
I hope so. I'm just grateful, literally, Alex, to wake up in the morning. I don't take that for granted. You know, part of my story, everyone I think has kind of a story, is I was raised in a church that was Mormon church that does a lot of genealogy work. And I knew as a kid growing up, because of the genealogy work, that most of my male relatives died young. They basically pretty much all the men died in their 50s, early 60s. I don't think there was only one man in all the genealogy work that we had going. We went back almost 200 years. Not that we had data on everybody, but those that we did, birth and death dates and so forth. There was only one man and my family line that lived to 70.
Wow.
My father had his first heart attack at 57, just like my uncles and things. And then he had a myocardial infarction at 64 and died. Well, that really got my attention at that point. I was probably at that point in my early 40s, as I recall. And I had started professional life as an attorney, a corporate tax estate planning attorney. Did that for about 10 years. And then what happens with me is once I learn how to do something, I quickly get bored with it. And so it seems like every 10 years I change careers. So I started off as an attorney out of UCLA. Next career was an entrepreneur. I was building medical buildings and shopping centers and radio stations and just a whole bunch of stuff. Worst period of time of my life. It was I felt like a fireman, work every day putting out fires, and I realized that a semi-hermit should not be an entrepreneur. So anyway, then another graduate degree in psychology and so forth, and then my father died, and that was a real wake-up call. It's one thing to kind of know what the genealogy and family history is. It's one thing to be there when a loved one dies, actually, particularly at age 64. I mean, that's just
Yes.
It's just too soon. That's too short a life, 64. I'm going to be 78 next month, and so I'm the longest living, Lawrence person in our family, going back a long, long time. Anyway, when my father died, I was working on my PhD and finished that up, and I decided rather than chasing dollars and trying to accumulate more money and all that kind of stuff, mostly probably with my family history, to leave it to my children, I'd better make a change. And so that's why the PhD, and it was 30 some odd years ago. I changed careers. After I got the PhD in nutritional science, I started doing research work because the law degree was very helpful to do that. And I started off doing, I call it detective work. Actually, I was contracting with medical clinics here in the U.S. and individual holistic functional doctors doing research on various drugs that were being promoted by the pharmaceutical industry to explain to them the real effectiveness and the real side effects that were not being basically reported in a transparent way by the pharmaceutical companies. A recent example of that, of course, is the Pfizer COVID vaccine was being reported as a 95 to 97% effective. In reality, what we call the absolute effectiveness was 0.54.
Wow.
And
We
Dr.
can say they had the numbers were backwards.
Truly, yeah, they truly were. And what also was happening was that you have to dig deep into the pharmaceutical data that's put out, even to the FDA, to find out really what the truth is. And buried deep in hundreds of thousands of pages of information on the coronavirus was various information that was really never made apparent. And the sad thing is there are two ways of reporting statistical benefits. I won't go into the detail of that, but one overstates it, the other states it accurately. The FDA recommends that both be used, but it's a recommendation, a suggestion, and the pharmaceutical industry only takes, the one that reports the better. But anyway, so I started doing all that work for about 5 years, and it was fascinating. And then, of course, my father's death had lingered in my brain, and I thought, I need to really look into this longevity field. That was literally 25 years or so ago, and for 25 years now, I've been working in that area, longevity. And then Google Translator came along, and that was such a wonderful technological benefit, because I could now read published clinical studies in Mandarin, and from Albania, from Israel, from Russia, and I ran across studies from Russia that were intriguing, that they had developed what we were referring to as peptide bioregulators back in the Cold War days when they were the Soviet Union, and that they were very successfully using them for a variety of health benefits, and also for reducing mortality. And these were published clinical studies out of Russia. Professor Kavinson was the lead scientist in doing all this, and I was stunned that when I learned that he had something like over 700 published clinical studies or articles, and yet in the U.S. no one's ever heard of him, as far as I know, and don't pay any attention. So then I realized that I needed to find out what they were doing and learn about it. So a couple of emails back and forth, and went to Russia, 2012, knocked on the door, and they were very gracious, and I think they were stunned that a scientist, or whatever I was at that point, would be interested in what they were doing, because there's unfortunately no exchange of scientific information between the U.S. and most of the world. Maybe Britain, maybe Israel, but pretty much the rest of the world, the U.S. Ignored. So anyway, they took me in, and as I say, they were very gracious, and I worked with Professor Kavinson on and off, coming back and forth to Russia until the proxy war started over Ukraine. And he taught me everything that my little brain could absorb about peptide bioregulators. And then about, I guess, 7, 8 years ago, we talked about the fact that there's all this wonderful data, published clinical studies and so forth, showing the benefits of the bioregulators in half a dozen different languages, including English. But the world pays more attention to American studies and British studies than they do to studies from other countries, which is kind of an irony given what I know about most of at least the pharmaceutical studies. And so we talked, and we finally decided that let's run a clinical study to duplicate what he had done in Russia here in America. An American administrator, myself, American subjects, American labs, and so forth. So 7 years ago, we started with the telomere study, and then added the epigenetic DNA methylation study about 4.5 years ago. So that's the short history.
Amazing. I love the story because this is real. This is the real story, and it's not some big corporation or some big, it's just people coming together and going, hey, there's something really good. And that reminds me, when I first came across, which I actually, as you were speaking, I'm like, how did I first hear about peptide bioregulators? I don't know. I mean, I've also always been a researcher, and I was, my drive has been to always understand, how can I help people better? So instead of staying dogmatic, my innate drive is, well, there's got to be more information, more things that I don't know that will help me help others better. And of course, myself as well, because in many cases, I've been my hardest case to crack. And when I came across the information on peptide bioregulators, also from Russia, and I started reading the studies, I remember having goosebumps and literally euphoria, a feeling of euphoria all over my body, because I'm like, oh my God, this is a game changer. These are game changers. I already knew the importance of really caring for the regeneration of the endocrine system. And this just kind of completely fitted in with what I already knew and believed. And yes, and I remember thinking exactly, okay, so here's all these Russian studies, and no one is going to believe because the Russian studies, because they're Russian. And when I began, and this is like a little bit of a funny story, when I started taking the peptide bioregulators, I was experiencing sort of, I mean, I was 47 at the time, and I started experiencing perimenopause symptoms, hot flushes, and, the usual. And I didn't want to go onto hormones. I wasn't ready for that, and I don't know if I'll ever be. And then I found the peptide bioregulators, and literally within 4 or 5 weeks, all my symptoms were relieved. And, I'm now 50. I'm symptom free so far.
Mm-hmm.
The emotional roller coaster may be a little bit of a thing, but, there's no symptoms. And yet, so here's what happened. As I started to feel relief and I felt really good and strong within a short time, I remember I was bobbing around in the ocean, because we're currently living in Bali. And so I was happily bobbing around in the warm ocean, feeling so good, feeling so relieved and grateful, and just really this gratitude pouring out for the peptide bioregulators. And the next thought that jumped into my mind was like, oh my gosh, but what if this is a ploy? What if this is some kind of, something evil is sitting behind it? Because after all, the peptides are Russian. And I observed, yes, you may laugh. And so I observed this crazy thought, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, how do you even think that? But then I realized, well, this is probably a thought that many people would have. And I kind of, I let that go, and I thought, well, just enjoy how good you feel. And that was that. But I had to share this funny story.
I love that. I've never heard that thought. I'm going to have to share that with the Russians. They're going to love that.
Right? I mean, I know I had to laugh at myself because, like, I actually personally don't have anything against the Russians. I mean, hence I went and looked and so forth. But it was almost like the collective consciousness bug, was still somewhere sitting inside of me. And because these peptides worked so fast and so well, and I just felt so incredibly good, and I could almost feel like my whole foundation had been elevated. My whole foundation of health had been elevated. I could feel it. I mean, I'm very sensitive to these things. And I was like, wow. And I said to my husband, this is the best thing that I've ever found. And then the next thought was, what if? So it was funny. It was funny.
What
And, I let that go, of course. And yeah.
what if you accidentally wrote in Putin for president in the next election? That's what they were doing.
Ah, well. Yeah,
Anyway,
and of
yeah,
course, subsequently, I have spoken, I've also spoken to a Russian doctor that is behind the Cavenson products and all of that. And I mean, all I could say, also here in Bali, we actually have a lot of Russians living here. And so I've worked with various Russian healers, and my awareness has expanded to the level of, well, there's a lot that they know that we don't know.
yes,
As any culture has their own wisdom and beauties, and we need to share more, and we need to learn to listen more with an open mind. And at the same time, I'm so deeply grateful that we can nowadays say, well, they are not just Russian studies, but they are American studies run by Professor Bill Lawrence. And
mm,
so that's a great thing. So what can, because obviously here we're gonna, in another instance, we're gonna go into sort of the deeper workings of the peptide bioregulators. We're gonna have a presentation of yours, and I'll have a masterclass for those that want to learn more. So in this podcast, we just kind of want to raise awareness and share some of these incredible benefits of the peptide bioregulators, maybe starting with what is your personal experience with yourself, and then your experience as a researcher.
certainly. Before I answer that, I had that same kind of euphoric moment when I was sitting in Professor Cavinson's conference room the first time I was there, I guess 12 years or so ago, because what I realized, I wasn't floating around in a lovely ocean, but what I realized was that, because up to this point I had been doing everything I could for a long time to be healthy. I mean, everything that I could do, you know. And I sat there after we'd been together a few hours and so forth. And of course, I'd done the research before I got there. I realized this is how I get to live longer than all of my relatives have lived. This is how I can tack on, instead of dying at 55 or 65, I can tack on at least 10, 15, maybe 20 years. And I just sat there thinking, oh my goodness, this is like the greatest thing that could happen to me. I've researched it enough that I'm convinced it's real. And I'll, of course, start, testing myself and so forth first. But I had that same kind of moment, like you were floating around. I was sitting in the conference room. Well, but more specifically to what you were asking about, the first study was telomeres in caps of chromosomes and so forth. Incredibly important because the length of those telomeres determine how much cell replication we're going to get. And there's cell replication going on in every tissue, every organ in the body all the time. And Professor Cavinson's research had shown that he could extend, we call it the Hayflick limit. There's a Professor Leonard Hayflick, unfortunately, we just died a few weeks ago. UC San Francisco had determined a long time ago that there was a limit of about 70, 80 replications that a cell can go through. Cells are always replicating. Professor Cavinson proved with animal studies that he could extend that by about 42%, 42% more replication. And what the replication, the metaphor I use for that is that telomeres are sort of like tires on an automobile. It's like, how far can you journey on that set of tires? And
Mm-hmm.
Professor Cavinson with the peptides basically allowed me to have a set of tires that would go 42% further than any other tires. It's maybe an odd metaphor, but and so and at the time when I first was there, I had done some telomere testing, I think even the year before. And I'm guessing I was 66 or something like that. And my telomeres were that of an older man by about 4 or 5 years, which is normal for Americans. We tend to have what I call accelerated telomere loss, and it's primarily due to stress. We might get into that at some point. Bad diets, busy lifestyles, all that kind of stuff. So, but 2 years later, for the first time taking the peptides, my telomeres were lengthening. That's one of the holy grails in longevity, is to be able to lengthen your telomeres. And there's millions of dollars have been spent, studies and so forth, to try and do that. And over the years, I continued. And my last test was latter part of last year. I was 77. I'm going to be 78 next month. I was 77, and my telomeres are equivalent to a 23-year-old.
Wow, that's
And this is
incredible.
lab, yeah, this is lab tested, Spectre Cell Labs, Houston, Texas. The primary commercial lab testing for telomeres and so forth in the U.S. But it took a number of years to get there. I think by the third year, I was down into probably somewhere in the high 40s. I would have been in my almost 72 or 73. Um, so that's sort of the start of it all. And then we started, doing the same thing with the people in the clinical study. We have to now, at this point, I think we have about 150 people in the two clinical studies. About 85% of them are doctors, because we closed it off to non-physicians here a couple of years ago. It just takes a lot less time to work with a physician, because the clinical studies last 3 to 4 years to get to the goals that we set. And so over that period of time, if I'm dealing with a physician, it requires probably 1/5 the amount of time that it would with a layperson. So we started that DNA methylation study, and that's been very successful as well. Um, we're able to measure, based on Dr. Stephen Horvath's work at UCLA, the Horvath epigenetic clock. We're able to actually measure more or less pretty semi-accurately what we call the epigenetic age of people based on methylation levels. That is, where genes are turned on and turned off by methylation. And we have been able to significantly reduce people's epigenetic age. It's a different biomarker than the telomere. It's not just an age number. It's when we reduce people's methylation age, it's a reduction in mortality risk is what it is. And so Stephen Horvath found that if people have a higher epigenetic age than their chronological age, for instance, if, say, a person is 7 years older than epigenetically than their chronological age, they have a 100% increased all-cause mortality risk compared to their peers. In other words, you double your risk at that point if you're just 7 years older than your chronological. That's how powerful methylation and epigenetics are. On the other hand, if you were 7 years younger, you have a 50% reduced all-cause mortality. In other words, you're by half. You have cut your risk of mortality in half at that point. So that's how we measure the epigenetic markers. What we do for the telomeres and the DNA methylation or epigenetics is we set goals. So when a person comes in, we do baseline testing, telomeres and DNA methylation, and then we know what our goals are for a person, say an average person 60 years of age, will typically come in, if they're American, will come in about 4, 5, 6, even 10 years older than their telomere age. I'm sorry, than their chronological age. Our goal is to get a 60-year-old down to about 35, and we can do that very successfully. Not with everybody,
Hmm.
because what we do know is that lifestyle factors can offset even what we can do with the peptides. But I would say 95% of the people, we're able to get them down pretty close to their goal for telomeres, and the same with the DNA methylation. Probably 85 to 90% of those people. And we do this in about 3 years. we ask people to stay in the study voluntarily about 3 years, and that takes us that long to get to those goals.
That's incredible. And sort of for, the lay people, what we're saying is that as telomeres lengthen, in essence, the body goes back to its youthful capacity to regenerate itself.
Correct. Absolutely correct. Yeah.
And to me, that's the interesting piece, because we know that as we age, so you were talking about stress, any kind of stressor, because I think also the word stress is so often misused and misunderstood, because we can have a very stressed body even though our mind may think that we're not stressed, right?
Yes.
We have, and a lot of people kind of almost are addicted to stress, and therefore they love it, but that doesn't mean it's not affecting their body. So stressors, and stress can be anything from emotional, psychological, to environmental, metabolic stressors, right? So stress is really, when we say stress, it means anything that puts the body into a state where it can't adapt in a positive way. So there's a negative sort of maladaptation that happens. And that is what really causes aging, right? The breakdown of the body, because it's a systematic and systemic breakdown. I always correlated it a little bit to like when the windshield breaks from a little pebble, and there's like just a tiny little hole, and you can't even really see it, and you think, oh, whatever, I'll leave it. I've done that years past. And I think, oh, it's no big deal. And then it slowly makes a spider, and then eventually, and you still think, oh, I can get away with it, I don't want to spend the money, this was me in my 20s. And then one day you drive over like a little pothole or something, and the whole thing crashes.
Yeah, exactly.
And
That's a
it's
great
like,
metaphor.
right, I love that metaphor, because I've experienced exactly that. So I'm like, oh, I know exactly how these things happen.
Yeah.
And I feel
Yeah.
that's really the aging process, right? We think we can get away with it. We think we can get away with the stressors. And so when we lengthen the telomeres, we are basically retracting this spider web, and we're actually closing the hole.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. When we lengthen the telomeres, it allows this cell replication. And in a few moments, maybe we'll move over to DNA repair and what really drives aging. It's not the hallmarks of aging, and so we'll get onto that if we have time. Um, what happens when you restore telomeres is that your cell replication becomes almost perfect. And I say almost perfect because when cells replicate, there are all sorts of what we call lesions and other problems that are going on that basically try and impair the replication. And the replication of the cell has to be absolutely perfect in order for it to be functional and so forth.
Right.
And so when you restore those telomeres, then what you're getting, you're back to that 42% increase in replication and a longer life. And more importantly than just the length of it is the boost to one's health from that cell replication being perfect. Yeah, it's fascinating. Let's talk just for a moment about what causes aging, and I'll do it in a real brief kind of synopsis, because what causes aging is pretty much not what is out there in the public view and even in the scientific view, with a few exceptions. Cavinson and I talked about this early on in terms of, so what causes this aging? And it was interesting because the peptide bioregulators, I don't want to overstate it, but they certainly slow down and in many ways reverse a lot of elements of the aging process. They're the only thing that I know, other than I would say maybe caloric restriction, they're the only thing I know that has real science behind it that shows longevity benefits in humans, not just mice and all that stuff. Anyway, so it was kind of it was a backward kind of thing. We had the solution, that was the peptide bioregulators, but at least I didn't know what the problem, I didn't know the answer to the problem or what the problem was. And Cavinson over time sort of educated me. We have these hallmarks of aging that people talk about all the time. I think it used to be a dozen of them or 9 of them, and now it's like 14 different things and so forth. The hallmarks of aging are not primary aging drivers. They are more actually symptoms of the aging process. And what Cavinson educated me about is what drives aging is basically 3 things. And that is telomere loss. The second one is what we call DNA repair defects. And the third is a deteriorated DNA repair system. Okay, and we won't get into the details of it all, but what we have in our cells is just amazing. Every time I learn something new about the body, it's just amazing. I mean, absolutely amazing how complex the human system is. Anyway, we have this system called the DNA repair system in our cells. Every time the cells replicate, there is this mechanism, and I hate to call it a mechanism because that makes it sound mechanical, but there is this process. It's sort of, I think of it as sort of assembly line that a cell has to go through, and there are what we call checkpoints. So there's a process where the cell is being examined, you might say by an auditor or an inspector or so forth, to make sure that it's being replicated perfectly. Okay? And if it's not, because we have what we call lesions and insults and so forth caused by IV rays, diet, radiation, so forth, that bombard the cells all the time. In fact, it's estimated that there's probably anywhere between 10,000 and 100,000 of these lesions every single day on every single cell, which is mind-boggling. I'm also very curious about the graduate student who had to count those things or figure it out. Anyway, those are constantly assaulting the cells. When we're younger, this DNA repair system, call it the workshop or the maintenance department or whatever, it's functioning just like it should, and it wards off all of these lesions and assaults and so forth, and it allows the cell to replicate. As we get older, though, that the repair system kind of breaks down. We call it DNA repair defects. And as it breaks down, things like cancer pop up. As we get older, 60s, 70s, and so forth, we become vulnerable to, Alzheimer's and diabetes and all that stuff. And of course, diet and lifestyle impact that as well. But the real cause of the aging process is that the DNA repair system is broken. It's not functioning as it was when we were young people. So what's interesting is that the peptide bioregulators, and I would say there's probably 6 scientists in the world that have published anything in this area. There's just a small group of us that realize that this is the driver, and Cavinson is the one that taught me. What's amazing is that, to my knowledge, and I hope I'm wrong because I hope there's some other things out there, what the peptide bioregulators do is they go in and they repair the DNA repair system.
Absolutely.
That's that the workshop is going in and repairing everything, including the damage that's been done previously. And the proof of that is what I call the old age studies that Cavinson did and published he ran them in the late 90s, published in 2003 and 2004, where he took people that were, elderly, 60s, 70s, and so forth, put them on a couple of peptides. They only were using 1 or 2 at that time. And over a period of 10, 12 years, but only using the peptides for the first couple of years, they reduced people's mortality like 70, 80%. And
wow.
The method that what was happening was that, again, we're only talking about 2 peptides. Now we have 21 or 22, depending on how you count them. With just those 2 peptides, what was happening is true cellular reprogramming. They were actually fixing the repair system so that it operated like a young person. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
that's what drives aging is those three things: telomere, DNA repair accumulation, and the defects in the repair system.
Right. I recently got deeply into genomics, and so
Hmm.
been studying DNA and methylation, and how, when we look at our individual DNA and we go deep into each DNA, into each SNP, that's when we really see, I so often I'm able to see the trauma that happened in the lineage, knowing
Hmm.
that, and obviously not the specific one, but depending on what's been going on in someone's DNA, we can see, well, you definitely come from a lineage of a lot of trauma.
Yeah.
And knowing that trauma alters the expression of our DNA, then we can also see how, the fact that, yeah, we can see how disease is passed on from trauma genetically. And at the same time that we have epigenetic power to change that. And I would agree with you that besides, of course, the basics, which, diet, exercise, and so forth, which needs to be matched to our DNA, to our bioindividuality, there's nothing more powerful than peptide bioregulators for exactly the reason that you've been explaining, that it is the only thing that we know to date that actually brings up the peptide saturation back to its original strength or percentage, right?
Yeah, or functionality, I call it. Yeah.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
there's a there's a Nobel Prize recipient, a wonderful man who received the Nobel Prize a few years ago. Has just written a book that was released a month or two ago. His name is Venke Ramakrishnan, if I'm probably mispronouncing it. The book that he wrote is called Why We Die, and it's a
Mm-hmm.
fascinating book. He is one of, that I'm aware of, he's one of probably 5 or 6 scientists in the world that understand that what aging is I would call it the unified cause of aging is telomeres, DNA modify or DNA repair system defects and so forth. And he talks about it in the book.
Right. And so when, what I would like for people, the switch that I would like for people to go off, because that's the switch that eventually went off for me, is that in most treatments, in most therapeutic approaches, whether that's functional medicine, whether that's even holistic medicine, the various medicines that are out there, we are we are impacting what happens down there on on a chemistry level, right? What happens in the liver, what happens in the digestive system. So we're trying to impact the chemistry of the body, and of course that works to a degree. And then depending on what you choose, functional medicine, holistic, there's pro and cons to either. But what I so love about working with the peptide bioregulators is that we are working at a much higher level of impact, which then trickles down. So you're not working down here, you're working up here. And by working up here, you are really impacting where things matter the most, where, because there's this whole trickle down effect. We know that when the endocrine system is working properly, also the organs will function properly. And so everything is kind of, in some ways, we can say, really directed by the peptides.
Yes, we call it upstream. The peptides address um, health literally at the top of the stream, you might say, because what they're doing is, you hear the word cellular reprogramming thrown around a lot these days. And yet, when I look for the proof, be it at a meeting or a YouTube or reading or something, there's no proof for it. They're just throwing that term around.
Yeah.
What the peptides uniquely do is they reprogram at the cellular level, which results in tissue rejuvenation, which ultimately then results in organ regeneration. And that's the most upstream that you can possibly be is when you're regenerating the entire organ or system, as you were saying, endocrine system. If you're
Yeah,
regenerating at that level, downstream, you get all of these benefits. Now, you probably have to deal, with some things downstream, of course, as well, because there are some drugs and there's some functional and holistic things that are helpful for the symptoms and so forth. But you really need to address the upstream, because if you don't, those problems are very likely going to reoccur. And
absolutely.
these become more permanent fixes at this point.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, there we go. That in some ways, that's all people need to know, right? In a nutshell, to begin what I call really the love affair with peptides, and to see that we can do all. And I'm still a fan of doing things down here, because, as you say, when we've been living with a malfunction up here, of course, whatever has happened down below, downstream, needs to be addressed
Mm-hmm.
in order to bring things back up to speed. But the beauty is that when we work upstream, the trickle down effect is going to happen, and you're not going to kind of take yourself out of ease, because dis-ease and ease as easily, because now your body knows what to do really on a cellular level. The DNA switches are once again working. So I'm curious to hear, because we know that, of course, nowadays so many of us live with methylation issues, with polymorphisms. And what is your experience with the peptide bioregulators with these various genetic polymorphisms?
I don't have, Alex, direct experience because, as you know, I'm not a licensed physician. There are 150 or whatever the number is, physicians mostly in those clinical studies. So I get feedback from them, or what
Mm.
happens is they will, they'll be in the program for 6 months or a year, and they start seeing lab tests improve from themselves and so forth. And then they start adding their patients. And I can't deal directly with their patients because they're not enrolled in the clinical studies. I can't give medical advice because I shouldn't.
Sure.
But the physicians will then send me an email and they'll say, I have a stage 3 kidney patient who's headed for dialysis. Are there peptides that would maybe be helpful? And so I can send the physician some research material, including, what peptides would be appropriate for that, because we have a peptide for the kidney and so forth. And as you know,
Yeah.
we don't ever just use one peptide. It's always a combination of several. And so they then use the peptide, modify it, use the program that I send down, and then I get feedback. I sometimes get actual lab results and so forth. In terms of the things that you're asking about, I don't have any experience there, so I can't really comment because I haven't had that kind of feedback. The type of things that the peptides can do are organ and system related. There has to be some organ damage that we can repair. So that's the
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing I get the feedback from doctors with regard to liver, kidneys, thyroid, and so forth. And they send me oftentimes the ongoing labs. So I have a lot of knowledge about those things, but not some of the other things. For instance, Lyme disease and so forth falls outside of what we can do with the peptides. Again, that shows that
Right.
you've got to deal with the Lyme disease first, and then deal with the organs that it has impacted.
Yeah, absolutely. And
So
so I know that at some point you were working with people to help them recover from COVID, and how is that going? And I know that it was, as we know, very difficult, especially when they've been vaccinated, like those that are dealing with long-term COVID. What, has anything changed there? What's been your latest findings and experiences?
okay, if we put them into two classes, the primary issue that I was working with and started the research literally before they were even coming up with around the time that they were coming up with the vaccine. I knew there were going to be problems. You don't create a safe and effective vaccine in 7 months. It just isn't possible. Anyway, so I started doing the research. when I learned about the spike protein that was in, of course, both the virus and particularly in the vaccine, um, I knew that was going to be a problem. The pharmaceutical industry represented that the spike protein from the vaccination would only stay in the body 24 to 48 hours. It would be localized in the deltoid and so forth. And I wondered at the time, how is it that they can control that? Because the basis of the spike protein is a self-replicating spike protein that is a little spike protein factory. And how do you confine that? And how does it leave the body? Anyway, turns out none of that was true. So I started working on the research for spike protein. In other words, what can you do to reduce the spike protein load if you've been vaccinated or have been exposed to the virus? And again, evidence-based, came up with a protocol of about 15 things that had some evidence. I call it the menu because I can't offer it, even though spike protein is not represented or recognized as a medical condition at this point, but of course it certainly is. I still have to be careful. Anyway, so I worked up a protocol, and it's been very effective in reducing spike protein, which is very difficult to measure, but based on the symptom relief that people have been achieving, again, through the doctors, the spike protein protocol works very well. And it's the interesting thing about it is it's not pharmaceuticals that you use. Pretty much over-the-counter products are just really powerful. For instance, there's two aspects to the, and I don't want to get into weeds today, but there's two aspects to this spike protein problem. What the spike protein does is it sails through the blood system, goes through the tissues, end up residing in organs, and then it continues to replicate at that point. And so if you look at a schematic of the human body, today we can look and see that spike protein is basically in every single organ, or at least hypothetically it can be. And so there's a two-pronged process to reducing the spike protein. The first part is that you have to, the spike protein interferes with what we call the p53 gene and the p53 protein. Those two are the frontline fighters, you might say, in terms of the immune system. It's the p53s that keep cancer at bay, because we all have cancer all the time in our bodies. But what keeps it at bay is a healthy p53 gene and p53 protein. What was discovered early on in vitro at that point, this is talking within 3 months of the vaccinations rolling out, is that the spike protein interferes with or deteriorates the functionality of the p53 gene and p53 protein. What that means is that you're losing some of your frontline troops for cancer abatement or cancer avoidance. And what we're seeing today, people are using the term turbo cancer. People who have no history of cancer or have been in remission and so forth, for a number of years, come back and see their doctor and they're in stage 3 cancer, yet they've been in remission for a number of years, or they have no cancer history and they die fairly quickly. So you have to address that, and you address that on a protocol with two simple things. Selenium and, of all things, flaxseed will restore the functionality of the p53 protein, which will then restore the p53 gene. Then on the other side of it, just to unload the spike protein out of the body, there are a whole bunch of things like bromelain, NAC, but it has to be a special form of NAC called augmented NAC. The Italians developed this about 9 months ago. Regular NAC is helpful to deal with the spike protein. It will, in a petri dish, it will destroy about 10% of the spike protein that it comes in contact with. The new NAC called augmented NAC from Italy in a petri dish destroys 98% of the spike protein. And it's not expensive. I think it's going to be on Amazon. They told me from Italy, I've been bringing it in from Italy. They told me that soon they would be able to sell it on Amazon. But there's other things too. You hear about the people having the blood clots and so forth, and sudden cardiac events and so forth. you can pretty much fix that with things like nattokinase, serrapeptase, boloke, and so forth. So there's that protocol which I've sent all the doctors, and they're telling me it's very effective. Um, the yeah, I don't want to go into the sticks any more than that. So yeah.
Yeah, no, we've had great results with enzyme, high enzyme therapy, and of course in combination with peptides and all the things. But yeah, flaxseed being a great, very very simple remedy for a lot of these issues. Um, yeah, I mean, I think you and I, we could probably go on and on and on and on. And I'm a person, like, I can sit here and ask you a billion questions. Like, I won't get tired of listening to you. And I so deeply, deeply appreciate your time and the work that you've been doing. And, personally, I always love speaking to people like you who have a deep personal story, and who've been vested from a personal level, and who have acquired the level of wisdom because they were driven not by profit, but really by something real, by the appreciation for life, and by the refusal to believe that we don't have the answers. And that's what I always tell my clients. I always like to leave anyone who listens to anything of mine with really the deep knowing we live in a world where we have everything at our disposal, everything at our fingertips to regenerate and to really live a beautiful life that feels good in our body. And I kind of always stress that because I feel like the first 40 years of my life, I did not enjoy living in a body. And for so many years, it was like, how's it possible? Right? How's it possible that no one can help me to make this experience of being in a body enjoyable?
Mm.
And so, like you, I had to go and figure it out. And knowing what it means, that's the message that I like to leave people with, to know you can absolutely have a beautiful, enjoyable experience of living in a body. And, when I listen to your story, Bill, I'm also just inspired by your drive for real wisdom, and your drive to spread the level of wisdom, because that's really what we need in today's world for this terribly broken healthcare system. And another thought that I always have is, really, do we, like, there's so many bigger things that we should be worrying about or enjoying, and how many of us are bogged down by health issues when really that's not what we should be bogged down with, right? Like, it's a bit terrible to be bogged down by health issues. So if you're listening to this and you're finding yourself in a situation, there is absolutely help, and it doesn't have to be so complicated either. So is there anything else, Bill, that you would like to add for those that are listening?
Um, two things. I'm not sure how much wisdom is attributed to me. Um, I work really hard at what I do. I'm not sure about the wisdom part of it, but the second thing is be grateful. Literally, I wake up in the morning, I open my eyes, and it's like, yeah, another day. Another day. I'm alive, and before I get out of bed, I'll recite to myself five things that I'm grateful for. One is my wife, Bess, and my health, and and the work that I do, and the rest of it kind of varies a little bit, but I don't take it for granted. And so oftentimes people will say, "How's your day going?" And I'll say, "I woke up this morning." It's such a gift.
That is a wonderful reminder, I think, for all of us, no matter how old we are, to, yes, be grateful. And as much as I love a practice of gratitude, sometimes I'm guilty of forgetting. And so I'm very grateful for you today, Bill, for that reminder, and to sort of make that practice, yes, that before we even get out of bed, to recite five things that we are grateful for. I think that is a phenomenal practice for our well-being and for youthening besides the peptide bioregulators.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Bill. And we are going to be definitely speaking to you sometime soon in the masterclass. So for those of you that have been listening to this podcast and that are interested in learning more, please go find us on the website enlight.life, where we're going to be announcing the masterclass with Bill Lawrence to really go more in depth and really look at the hard data that Bill has been working on for so many years, so that you can really, because of course this was just a beautiful conversation. Yes, some things were mentioned, but for those of you that are really interested in the hardcore data, we'll have a masterclass, and it's going to be very, very fascinating. So thank you all for joining me here and for listening. And again, thank you, Bill, for your time. Deeply appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure, as always.
Thank you.